Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Unexplained Files. Tonight we're repeeling back the layers on one of the most bizarre and highly classified programs in U.S. history, the CIA's Stargate Project. Imagine a world where the Cold War isn't just fought with nuclear missiles and covert agents, but with the human mind itself. A world where the Pentagon seriously considers using psychics to spy on the Soviet Union, to find lost spies, and to even peer into the future. That's the unnerving, almost unbelievable premise of Project Stargate, and it's a story that blurs the line between science fiction and top-secret reality. Before we dive into the mystery, if you're as fascinated by the unknown as I am, please hit that like and subscribe button. It helps us find more stories that deserve to be told. Drop a comment below with a mystery you think is due for a new look. All right, turn down the lights, get comfortable, and let's begin our investigation. You find yourself standing in a dimly lit, nondescript room in the late 1970s. The air is thick with the scent of old paper and the hum of fluorescent lights. A man sits across from you, his eyes closed, a pen hovering over a blank sheet of paper. His task is simple yet utterly impossible: to describe a location he has never seen, a place that exists only in the mind of the man in the next room. This isn't a scene from a B-movie. This is a highly classified military experiment. The project, officially known as the Stargate Project, was born from a very real and very serious fear that the United States was falling behind its primary adversary in a new, unproven arena of warfare: psychic espionage. It was a time of immense paranoia. The Soviet Union was the evil empire, and every rumor, every whisper of a new weapon or a new technology was taken with deadly seriousness. Reports, some credible and some entirely fabricated, began to trickle into the CIA, claiming that the Soviets were pouring massive resources into what they called psychotronic research. The fear was that the Soviets were training a new kind of spy, one who could transcend physical barriers, a spy who could, with the power of their mind, infiltrate the most secure facilities and extract the most sensitive information. You can almost feel the tension in the room. The weight of a nation's security resting on a belief that the human mind holds untapped, paranormal potential. This wasn't some rogue operation run by a couple of fringe enthusiasts. Stargate was a government-funded, military-sanctioned program, and its participants were not hippies or shamans, but military officers, engineers, and scientists. Their mission was to scientifically validate the existence of what they called remote viewing, the ability to perceive a distant or unseen target using extrasensory perception, or ESP. This was a radical departure from conventional intelligence gathering. Instead of satellite photos or bugged phones, the CIA was considering a new tool: the human brain. The whole endeavor was predicated on the unproven hypothesis that information, like a radio wave, could be perceived across vast distances, a notion that challenged everything known about physics and biology. One of the lesser-known details of the project's inception is that it wasn't just a reaction to the Soviets. It was also driven by a genuine belief among a small but influential group of scientists and officials that the paranormal was a legitimate field for scientific inquiry. They believed that there were aspects of reality that traditional science had yet to grasp, and that by applying rigorous methodology, they could finally prove what centuries of folklore and anecdotal evidence had suggested. The initial funding, which was small but consistent, came from a desire to either prove the claims once and for all, or to definitively debunk them and put the Cold War's psychic arms race to rest. This was the fundamental question at the heart of the project. Was it a legitimate scientific inquiry into the nature of consciousness? Or was it an elaborate exercise in confirmation bias, a self-fulfilling prophecy fueled by Cold War paranoia? The answer, as you'll soon discover, is far from simple and depends entirely on which side of the declassified documents you choose to believe. You have to wonder, when faced with such an existential threat as the Cold War, and with no verifiable proof either way, would you, as a government official, choose to investigate a highly unconventional, seemingly impossible solution, or would you dismiss it out of hand, risking the possibility that your enemy was gaining an insurmountable advantage? It's a question that forces you to confront the limits of rationality in a world where the stakes are life and death, and where the line between fact and fiction is constantly being redrawn. The room around you begins to shift. The fluorescent lights fade, replaced by the soft glow of a California afternoon spilling through the windows of a research facility. You're now at the Stanford Research Institute, or SRI, in the early 1970s. This is the birthplace of what would become the Stargate Project. The CIA didn't just invent psychic spying out of thin air. They inherited it from the pioneering and often controversial work being done here by physicists Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ. These two men, both respected in their fields, had a radical idea: to take psychic phenomena out of the realm of carnival shows and into the sterile, controlled environment of a laboratory. They were the architects of remote viewing, a term they coined to describe a structured, repeatable protocol for accessing information psychically. The methodology was simple in its premise, yet deceptively difficult to execute. A sender would be given a randomly selected, isolated location to visit. A viewer, the psychic, would be kept in a separate, isolated room completely unaware of the target location. The only information the viewer received was a set of geographic coordinates. The goal was to produce a series of drawings and descriptive narratives of the location. This wasn't about visions of the future or communicating with the dead. It was a cold, clinical attempt to use ESP for intelligence gathering. The hope was that by using this protocol, they could filter out the noise and validate the genuine signal of psychic perception. One well-established fact from this period is the sheer number of controlled trials they conducted. The early SRI experiments involved hundreds of sessions, targeting everything from specific buildings in San Francisco to a unique art installation in New York. The results, as reported in their scientific papers, were statistically significant. They claimed a success rate far beyond chance, a claim that would later be a source of fierce debate. You can sense the optimism in the air, the belief that they were on the verge of a scientific breakthrough. But there's a lesser-known detail about these early experiments that adds a layer of complexity: the role of what's known as front-loading. Critics of the project, including a famous stage magician and investigator, would later argue that the SRI experiments were not truly blind. They claimed that the receivers or viewers were often given subtle cues, or that the process of judging the results was subjective. For example, if a viewer described a body of water and a boat, and the target was a harbor, it would be counted as a hit. But if the target was a mountain, that same description would simply be a miss. There was an inherent flexibility in the grading system that, critics argued, allowed for a high degree of confirmation bias. The project was built on the idea that these hits were undeniable evidence of psychic ability. But were they? Or were they just the result of a very creative and very well-funded game of hot and cold? This leads you to a crucial question. When a system is designed to find a specific result, can it ever be truly objective? If a protocol is flexible enough to count both a pond and an ocean as a body of water, are you measuring a psychic phenomenon, or are you just measuring your own desire for the experiment to succeed? The distinction is critical. If the groundwork of the entire Stargate project was built on a flawed, self-affirming methodology, then everything that followed, the years of military funding, the classified missions, the claims of success, was built on a house of cards. The atmosphere in that SRI lab, with its promise of a new kind of science, was both thrilling and potentially misleading. It was the moment the paranormal entered the mainstream, but it came with a price: a loss of the rigorous skepticism that defines true scientific inquiry. The quiet, almost academic atmosphere of the SRI laboratory is about to be shattered by a figure who embodies the very essence of the paranormal, a man whose name became synonymous with the impossible. You see him now, a charismatic young Israeli with a captivating smile and a confident air. His name is Uri Geller. Geller's arrival at SRI was a pivotal moment for the burgeoning remote viewing program. Puthoff and Targ, in their quest for legitimacy and funding, saw Geller as the perfect subject. Here was a man who performed his psychic feats not on a television stage but under the purported scrutiny of scientists. His presence lent an air of gravity to the entire enterprise, a magnetic aura that drew both true believers and the most ardent skeptics. The well-established fact here is that Geller was extensively tested by the SRI researchers. and their report, published in the prestigious journal Nature, was a thunderclap in the scientific community. They documented his ability to, among other things, seemingly bend metal objects with his mind and accurately reproduce drawings that had been made in a separate, sealed room. You watch as a metal spoon, resting on a tabletop, begins to slowly, almost imperceptibly curl. There's no visible force, no string, no trickery that you can immediately discern. Geller is simply staring at it, his concentration palpable. Another man in a different room draws a simple picture, perhaps a star or a boat. Geller, in your presence, holds a pen over a sheet of paper, his eyes closed, and begins to draw. The lines are hesitant at first, but they eventually coalesce into a clear, recognizable image of a star. It's a performance that defies rational explanation, a live demonstration of what the SRI scientists were so desperate to prove, that psychic phenomena were real, measurable, and perhaps exploitable. But there's a lesser-known detail, a shadow that falls over these miraculous displays, the presence of skepticism and the possibility of a different kind of skill. A famous stage magician and debunker, James the Amazing Randi, was convinced that Geller was nothing more than a talented showman. Randi claimed he could replicate all of Geller's feats using classic stage magic techniques, and he went to great lengths to expose what he called trickery. He argued that the SRI scientists, for all their brilliance in physics, were amateurs when it came to sleight of hand and psychological manipulation. He pointed out the lack of consistent, tight controls in the experiments. For instance, he alleged that Geller was occasionally left unobserved with the objects he was meant to bend, and that the psychic drawings could have been transmitted through subtle cues or even small technical deceptions. He demonstrated how a performer could easily learn what a target drawing was through a small window in a door, or even by observing the sender's posture and movements. You feel a flicker of doubt. Is what you're seeing a genuine breakthrough or a highly polished theatrical act being judged by an unequipped audience? The question is not whether the spoon is bending, but how it is bending. Is it with the power of the mind, or is it a classic misdirection, a trick of the light and a sleight of hand? This controversy reveals a crucial weakness at the heart of the entire project. The scientists at SRI, and by extension the CIA, were so eager to validate the paranormal that they may have lowered their guard. They were experts in physics, not deception. They were looking for a signal, and in their eagerness they may have mistaken noise for evidence. The very idea of a psychic being tested in a controlled environment was revolutionary, but the protocols themselves were not foolproof. They were vulnerable to the kind of subtle manipulation that a master showman like Geller would have in his toolbox. Was the CIA's embrace of Project Stargate based on a genuine scientific finding, or was it a reaction to a well-executed magic show, one that tapped into the deepest fears of a paranoid Cold War era? This is the critical question. Geller's successes were the catalyst that gave the project a much-needed injection of credibility, and more importantly, funding. His abilities, as documented by Puthoff and Targ, served as the initial proof that psychic phenomena were not just folklore, but a tangible reality that could be harnessed for national security. It was the moment the CIA fully committed to the idea that psychic spies were not just a remote possibility, but a necessary investment. But as you watch Geller effortlessly manipulate metal and recreate hidden drawings, you can't help but ask yourself, did the Stargate Project truly begin with a scientific discovery, or did it begin with a mesmerizing trick? The answer may have determined the project's fate, and the course of a secret history that is only now beginning to be revealed. The spoon might have bent, but the line between science and spectacle had also been irrevocably warped. The stage is set, the initial proof has been presented, and now the real work begins. You are no longer in the public-facing laboratory of SRI, but in a more discreet, classified environment. The atmosphere is less about academic curiosity and more about military precision. The project, now firmly under the wing of the U.S. government, needs a new kind of operative. It's time to build a team. You see the key architects of this new psychic frontier, Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ, the same physicists from SRI, who now have a direct line to the intelligence community. They are no longer just researchers, they are the recruiters and trainers for a new kind of spy, They believe that psychic ability isn't a magical gift, but a latent human potential that can be trained and developed, much like a muscle. This is a well-established fact of the project's history. It moved from being a purely academic inquiry to a structured military-style training program. The personnel selected for this program are not the psychics you might imagine from a movie. There are no crystal balls or flowing robes. The recruits are often military officers or government employees with backgrounds in intelligence. They are grounded, logical, and skeptical by nature, which the project leaders believed was essential to prevent fraud and self-deception. The training is methodical. They sit in a quiet room, their minds cleared of all distractions. They are given a set of geographic coordinates and nothing else. Their task is to enter an altered state of consciousness, often through a meditative or hypnotic process, and reach out to the target location. The sessions are meticulously recorded, with every word and drawing documented. The idea is to create a repeatable, scientific process for an unscientific phenomenon. A lesser-known detail about this training is the sheer mental and psychological toll it took on the participants. The process was often described as mentally exhausting and disorienting. Trainees would spend hours in these sessions, struggling to separate their genuine psychic impressions from the chatter of their own imaginations. They had to learn to trust fleeting feelings, vague shapes, and colors that had no logical connection to their own reality. It was a battle not just against the unknown, but against their own rational minds. You can see the frustration on a recruit's face as they scribble indecipherable lines on a notepad, trying to translate a feeling of coldness or open space into a coherent description of a Soviet submarine base. The training was less about teaching a skill and more about teaching an entirely new way of thinking and perceiving the world. This leads you to a profound question about the nature of belief and perception. If you are told repeatedly that you have a latent ability and are trained to look for specific kinds of impressions, do you eventually create the very phenomena you are searching for? Could the Stargate Project have been a massive exercise in self-deception, where highly trained and disciplined individuals convinced themselves they were seeing things that were, in fact, just products of their own minds, shaped by subtle cues and the intense pressure to succeed? The belief in the project's goals was a critical component of its success, but that very belief may have been its ultimate undoing. The line between a genuine psychic signal and an expectation-driven hallucination is thin, and the Stargate Project was a constant, high-stakes walk on that line. You watch these new spies struggle to find their footing in a world where their most valuable asset is something that cannot be seen, touched, or measured by any conventional means. It's a new kind of warfare, fought not on a battlefield, but in the most inaccessible and mysterious territory of all, the human mind. You're no longer in a training room. The stakes have been raised exponentially. The sterile environment of the lab has been replaced by the high-pressure world of intelligence. You're in a secured room, perhaps in a government building in Maryland or Virginia, where the air is thick with the weight of national security. The team of remote viewers, now trained and ready, are being put to the ultimate test. Their targets are no longer randomly selected public places, but are now real-world, high-stakes intelligence targets. This is the heart of the Stargate Project's operational phase, and a well-established fact of its history is that the psychics were tasked with locating everything from Soviet submarines to tracking down lost spies. The missions are known as taskings, and they are carried out with a level of rigor designed to prevent any kind of conventional intelligence leakage. The remote viewer is given a sealed envelope. Inside is a piece of paper with a unique identifier, a code or a set of coordinates that corresponds to a specific target. The viewer is blind, meaning they have no other information. They don't know if the target is in Moscow, the Sahara, or the middle of the Pacific Ocean. They don't know if they are looking for a military installation or a missing person. Their job is simply to describe the location, the objects within it, and the activities taking place there. You can feel the intense concentration of the viewer as they close their eyes, their pen hovering over a notepad, attempting to translate a vague impression of a large cylindrical object or the feeling of a cold, damp space into a meaningful intelligence report. A lesser-known detail about these missions is the bizarre nature of the targets themselves. While some were conventional, others were less so. The Stargate psychics were reportedly asked to remote view everything from the location of ancient artifacts to the activities of an extraterrestrial entity. The project's scope was far broader than just military intelligence. There was a genuine, if unproven, belief that if the human mind could transcend space, it might also be able to perceive things outside the conventional understanding of reality. One of the most famous examples of this was the supposed tasking to locate a specific Soviet submarine that had been lost. The remote viewer, with no prior knowledge, allegedly described a large metallic vessel with a distinct kind of antenna, which later proved to be accurate. This begs a critical question. Were these successful hits genuine evidence of psychic ability, or were they a result of a highly sophisticated form of subconscious inference, perhaps picking up on subtle cues from the tasker, or even just statistical anomalies? In a world of hundreds of remote viewing sessions, a handful of startlingly accurate hits are bound to occur by pure chance. The challenge for the project was never to just produce a success, but to produce one under such controlled, double-blind conditions that chance could be definitively ruled out. You watch as a viewer sketches a crude drawing of a boat and some structures, and a flicker of hope and uncertainty crosses your mind. Could this be the moment that proves the impossible is possible? Or is it just another random sketch in a sea of countless failures? The very act of asking the question is what makes the Stargate Project so compelling and so maddening. You can feel the paranoia in the air, a chilling wind that blows not from the steppes of Siberia, but from the classified intelligence reports crossing desks in Washington, D.C. The Stargate Project, for all its eccentricities, was not born in a vacuum. It was a direct and desperate response to a perceived threat, a similar and potentially more advanced Soviet psychic program. The well-established fact here is that the CIA was convinced the USSR was pouring millions, if not billions, of rubles into what they called psychotronic research. Reports from defectors and intelligence sources, both credible and dubious, painted a picture of a vast network of psychic spies, of labs where the boundaries of the mind were being pushed to their limits. The Soviets were allegedly developing everything from telepathic communication with submarines to psychokinetic weapons that could interfere with electronics. This fear wasn't irrational. In the zero-sum game of the Cold War, any perceived advantage, no matter how outlandish, had to be countered. The Stargate Project, with all its peculiar protocols and personnel, was America's answer to a phantom army of Soviet psychics. The panic was fueled by a lesser-known detail that adds a layer of psychological complexity to the whole affair. The CIA's own internal report suggests that the Soviet threat might have been a masterful disinformation campaign. Some analysts began to suspect that the Soviets were intentionally leaking exaggerated or completely fabricated stories about their psychic research to bait the United States into wasting valuable resources on a scientific dead end. The logic was brilliant in its simplicity. Why fight your enemy with missiles when you can make them fight themselves with a delusion? The more the U.S. poured into the Stargate Project, the more they validated the Soviets' fake psychic prowess, all while drawing American scientific talent and funding away from more conventional and potentially more fruitful areas of research. This created a mirror image of fear and delusion, with both sides potentially chasing a ghost created by the other. You find yourself asking a deeply unsettling question. Was the Stargate Project a genuine effort to unlock the secrets of the mind, or was it a grand, multi-million-dollar psychological operation where the CIA itself was the unwitting target? The paranoia of the Cold War created a feedback loop of fear and suspicion. The U.S. heard a rumor of a Soviet psychic program and created its own. The Soviets saw the U.S. building a program and assumed their rumors had been proven true, leading them to likely double down on their own research, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of a psychic arms race that may have been based on nothing but mutual deception. The entire project might have been a long-running secret war, not against an enemy, but against a carefully constructed fiction. You have to wonder, in the absence of hard evidence, how do you know if you are investigating a real threat or simply responding to a well-crafted lie designed to make you see shadows in the dark? You're no longer in the paranoia-fueled atmosphere of the Cold War command center. You're in a quiet, sterile room facing a mountain of data. The task of making sense of the remote viewing sessions falls to a small group of analysts. The project, for all its grand aspirations, now confronts its most significant obstacle: the unpredictable data. A well-established fact about the Stargate Project is that the results were wildly inconsistent. For every purported hit that described a downed plane or a specific submarine, there were dozens, even hundreds, of sessions that were completely off target, filled with vague, symbolic, or nonsensical descriptions. The data wasn't clean. It was messy, chaotic, and resistant to easy interpretation. The challenge was in the analysis. How do you quantify a psychic impression? The analysts developed a scoring system known as the Coordinate Remote Viewing (CRV) analysis. A judge, blind to the target, would be given a transcript of the viewer's session and the actual target location. The judge would then score the session on a scale of 0 to 7, with a 7 being a perfect match and a 0 being a complete miss. A score of 6 or 7 was considered a direct hit, a score of 4 or 5 was a significant success, and anything below that was generally considered a miss. This was an attempt to bring scientific rigor to a non-scientific process. The system was designed to filter out the noise and identify the legitimate signal. A lesser-known detail about this process is the inherent subjectivity involved. Critics argued that the very act of a judge comparing a vague description to a known target was a breeding ground for confirmation bias. If a viewer said, "I see a large body of water," and the target was a lake, the judge might subconsciously give it a higher score, even if that description could apply to a million other places. If the viewer also mentioned a large metallic object, and the target happened to be a bridge over the lake, the score would go up even more. Conversely, if the viewer said, "I feel a sense of unease in a circular structure," and the target was a small house, it would be scored as a miss, even though the description might be a perfect match for a different target in another session. The analysts were constantly grappling with the problem of fuzzy data. The impressions were rarely literal, they were often symbolic or metaphorical, and the interpretation of these impressions was highly subjective. This brings you to a fundamental question. When the data is this ambiguous, is it possible to draw any definitive conclusion? Are the hits that the project celebrated genuine evidence of a psychic ability, or are they just the inevitable result of a flawed scoring system applied to an enormous amount of data? The project's leaders pointed to the statistical significance of their successes, arguing that the number of hits was far beyond what chance could account for. But skeptics countered that the scoring system itself was so lenient that it guaranteed a certain number of apparent successes. You find yourself looking at the transcripts trying to separate the genuine insights from the noise, and realizing just how difficult it is to find a clear signal when the very act of searching for it might be coloring your perception. The scope of the Stargate Project is about to expand beyond what even its initial founders could have imagined. The initial focus on remote viewing, a relatively grounded, if still extraordinary, concept of perceiving distant locations, was just the beginning. The project's success, however tenuous in gaining funding and legitimacy, encouraged its proponents to push the boundaries of what was possible. You find yourself in a briefing room, and the conversation has shifted from locating submarines to something far more ambitious. This is where the project began to embrace other, even more fantastic psychic phenomena, bridging the gap from a questionable science to outright paranormal belief. A well-established fact is that the Stargate Project's later years included research into precognition and psychokinesis. Precognition, the ability to see the future, was a particularly tantalizing prospect for an intelligence agency. Imagine a spy who could predict a terrorist attack before it happened or foresee the outcome of a political negotiation. The project's leaders, buoyed by their perceived successes, began to explore this. Remote viewers were reportedly tasked with describing events that had not yet occurred. The results, as you might expect, were even more inconsistent and difficult to verify than their spatial remote viewing counterparts. A psychic might describe a sense of upheaval or a bright flash of light, and the event might be interpreted as a political coup or a natural disaster, but the link was always tenuous and open to a myriad of interpretations. The project was moving from the realm of perception to the realm of prophecy. A lesser-known detail about this phase of the project is the attempt to explore psychokinesis, or the ability to move objects with the mind. This wasn't about a person levitating a car, but rather subtle, small-scale experiments. The researchers reportedly tried to influence the output of random number generators using only the power of their minds. The idea was that if a person could subtly influence a stream of data, that ability could theoretically be scaled up to disrupt enemy communications or even missile guidance systems. These experiments, as documented in the Declassified reports, were even more inconclusive than the remote viewing sessions. The results were often statistically insignificant, and the entire endeavor seemed to be a desperate attempt to find any paranormal ability that could be weaponized. The project had, in many ways, lost its initial scientific grounding and had become a kind of paranormal fishing expedition. This leads you to a critical question. Was this expansion a natural evolution of a groundbreaking scientific endeavor? Or was it a symptom of a project that was failing to deliver concrete results and was therefore grasping at increasingly far-fetched straws to justify its continued existence? When a program promises the ability to find submarines with the mind, and the results are debatable, is it a good idea to then promise the ability to see the future and move objects? The project's slow descent into the truly fantastical, far from being an intellectual triumph, may have been a sign of its terminal decline. It's a sobering thought that the more ambitious the project's goals became, the further it moved from any semblance of verifiable reality, chasing a promise that was always just beyond its reach. The project, for all its struggles, was not without its moments of alleged glory. You can feel the change in the atmosphere from one of scientific skepticism to hushed excitement. The declassified documents and anecdotal accounts from former participants are filled with stories of what the project's proponents call a glimmer of success. A well-established fact is that the Stargate Project's defenders and former participants often point to a handful of specific, high-profile missions as proof of its efficacy. These are the success stories, the moments that justified the years of funding and the deep-seated belief in the project's potential. One of the most famous examples, and one that has been discussed in both official reports and popular media, is the purported location of a downed Soviet Tu-95 Bear bomber. According to the accounts, in 1979, a Soviet plane crashed in Africa. The U.S. had a general idea of the region but was unable to pinpoint the exact location from satellite imagery. A remote viewer, tasked with finding the crash site, allegedly produced a detailed drawing that included a specific kind of debris field and a geological feature that matched the eventual discovery. The drawing was so accurate that it was allegedly used by the search team to narrow down their search area and locate the wreckage. Another off-cited case involves the location of a Chinese nuclear facility. A remote viewer, given only coordinates, reportedly described a large, circular, underground structure. This description was later confirmed by conventional intelligence sources, leading to a scramble by the U.S. to understand how the psychic could have possibly known this information without any prior knowledge. But a lesser-known detail about these successes is the intense scrutiny and internal debate they caused. Critics of the project, even within the CIA itself, argued that these hits were nothing more than a combination of cold reading, confirmation bias, and pure chance. In the case of the downed bomber, for instance, the remote viewer had already been briefed on a vague region of Africa, and the target was a high-stakes, well-known event. The details of the drawing, while seemingly specific after the fact, could have been interpreted in a variety of ways before the wreckage was found. It is like a psychic predicting a famous celebrity will experience a setback in their career, and then claiming they were right when the celebrity has a public scandal. The description is broad enough to fit a number of scenarios. The same could be said for the Chinese nuclear facility. The viewer's description of a large, circular underground structure is vague enough to potentially describe many different kinds of facilities. The key, as always, is whether the information was genuinely new and actionable, or simply confirmed what was already suspected. This leads you to a crucial question. What does a successful result truly prove? Does a single or even a handful of successful sessions in a sea of hundreds of failures prove the existence of a psychic ability, or does it simply prove the law of averages? Was the CIA celebrating these wins because they were statistically improbable, or because they were so desperate for a win that they ignored the vast majority of failures and the glaring methodological flaws. The glimmers of success became the lifeblood of the project, the stories that kept the money flowing and the belief alive. But you have to wonder, were they the project's greatest triumph or its most elaborate self-deception? You're standing in a sterile room, a large conference table before you, covered in charts and graphs. The previous excitement of the success stories has given way to the cold, hard reality of scientific scrutiny. This is where the project's most significant and enduring criticisms take center stage. The methodology behind the Stargate Project's claimed successes is now being put on trial. A well-established fact is that the project was plagued by methodological flaws that made it impossible to definitively prove the existence of psychic abilities. The Stanford Research Institute and later the CIA attempted to implement a rigorous double-blind protocol, but a lack of consistent standardized procedures left a great deal of room for error and bias. The primary issue was the concept of cueing. Even in a blind session, subtle, often unconscious cues could be given to the remote viewer. The tone of a tasker's voice, a sigh of disappointment, or an unconscious nod of approval could all, theoretically, provide enough information for a talented, highly perceptive individual to make a seemingly impossible guess. For example, if a viewer describes a large body of water and the tasker's reaction is neutral, the viewer might move on. But if the tasker gives a subtle positive cue, the viewer might feel encouraged to continue in that direction, fleshing out details about the shoreline or the types of boats present. This is a classic example of confirmation bias, a lesser-known detail that undermines the entire premise of the project. The researchers and the viewers were all human, and they all wanted the project to succeed. This desire could subconsciously influence the way the experiments were conducted and the way the results were interpreted. The scoring system, too, came under fire. Critics argued that the subjective nature of the judging was a fatal flaw. A session's score could depend on who was judging it. A believer might find a connection between a viewer's sketch of a square building and a rectangular target, while a skeptic would dismiss it as too vague to be meaningful. This led to what some have called a file drawer problem, where only the impressive-looking successes were highlighted, while the far more numerous failures were quietly filed away and ignored. This selective presentation of data created a false impression of success and made it impossible for independent researchers to replicate the results. This leaves you with a critical question. In a world where the lines between subconscious influence, pure chance, and genuine psychic ability are so blurred, how can we ever be sure of what we are truly observing? Was the Stargate Project a noble scientific endeavor, or was it an elaborate house of mirrors, where the scientists and subjects were so lost in their own expectations that they saw a reflection of success where there was only a reflection of their own desire? The very foundations of the project were built on a belief that was not just unproven, but actively resisted verification. You have to wonder, did the pursuit of the paranormal ultimately blind the very people who were trying to decode it? The stakes are suddenly much higher. The air in the room is tense, thick with the weight of a life hanging in the balance. The project has moved beyond theoretical exercises and vague taskings to a real-world, high-profile case that put its supposed abilities to the ultimate test. You find yourself immersed in the case of the missing general. This is a well-established, though still highly debated event in the Stargate Project's history. The year is 1980, and U.S. Army Brigadier General James L. Dozier has been kidnapped by Italian Red Brigade's terrorists. The search is a global effort, a frantic scramble of conventional intelligence agencies. But they are hitting dead ends. In a moment of desperation, the Stargate team is tasked with finding him. A remote viewer, given only a set of coordinates, allegedly began to describe the location of the general's confinement. The descriptions were cryptic at first. A dusty old building, a feeling of being underground, the sound of church bells. The viewer's impressions were translated into sketches and notes, which were then compared with conventional intelligence. The information was not direct or actionable enough on its own, but it was used as a supplementary tool, a piece of a much larger puzzle. The remote viewer allegedly zeroed in on a specific location in Italy, a small apartment building. The feeling was so strong that it was included in the daily intelligence briefings. A lesser-known detail about this case is the heated debate that ensued within the intelligence community. While the Stargate proponents hailed this as a major success, pointing out that the general was eventually found in a location that matched some of the remote viewers' descriptions, the conventional intelligence agencies were far more skeptical. They argued that the remote viewing data was too vague to be of any real use, and that the general was ultimately found through conventional police work and a tip from an informant. They pointed out that the remote viewer IS impressions of church bells and dusty buildings could describe 1,000,000 different places in Italy. The critics claimed that the hit was a classic example of retrospective matching, where the project's data was made to fit the outcome after the fact. It was a perfect opportunity for confirmation bias to take hold. This brings you to a critical question. When is a piece of information truly useful? If a remote viewer provides a vague description that is later confirmed by a conventional source, who gets the credit? Does it prove the psychic's ability, or does it simply show how easy it is to find a correlation between a vague piece of data and a known outcome? The Dozier case, far from being a clear win for the Stargate Project, became a microcosm of the entire debate. It was a case where the project's proponents saw irrefutable evidence of success, while its detractors saw a prime example of an expensive and unproven program trying to take credit for the work of others. It forces you to confront the reality that even in the highest stakes situations, the line between a genuine psychic insight and a lucky guess can be almost impossible to discern. The psychic operations are about to take a turn for the truly bizarre. You're in a secured room, but the target is no longer a building or a person. The target is a planet. This is perhaps the most famous and most controversial of the Stargate Project's missions, the remote viewing of Mars. It's a well-established fact, as documented in the Declassified files, that in 1984, remote viewer Joseph McMoneagle was tasked with describing a location on the planet Mars at a specific time, approximately 1,000,000 years in the past. The coordinates provided were for a region of the planet known as Cydonia, a place that had already captured the public's imagination due to satellite photos of what appeared to be a humanoid face and other geometric structures. McMoneagle's session, which has since been widely published, is a narrative that sounds like something straight out of a science fiction movie. He describes seeing large triangular structures, huge pyramids, and other geometric shapes that looked like they had been built by an intelligent ancient civilization. He saw remnants of a highly advanced, but now extinct species. He described them as very tall, very thin, and that they were dying or leaving the planet due to a cataclysmic event. He even described a massive storm, a sense of a great flood. His account was so vivid and detailed that it captivated the imagination of UFO enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists for decades. But a lesser-known detail, and one that adds a layer of crucial skepticism, is the immense potential for information leakage and confirmation bias in this particular session. The target, Cydonia, was already a subject of immense public and media speculation at the time. The face on Mars was a hot topic, and it's highly likely that McMoneagle, a U.S. government employee, was at least subconsciously aware of the controversy and the existing theories. He might have seen the photos in a magazine, a newspaper, or even in an internal briefing. The human mind is incredibly adept at weaving existing information into a seemingly new narrative, and his detailed description of pyramids and structures might have been his subconscious mind's interpretation of the publicly available photographs. It's the very definition of fishing for data, where a viewer's subconscious latches onto pre-existing, even vague information and presents it as a psychic impression. This brings you to a critical question. Was this session a stunning and terrifying example of an extraterrestrial revelation, or was it the ultimate example of a self-fulfilling prophecy, a product of a human mind brilliantly, and perhaps unconsciously, connecting dots that were already there? The Mars session is the Stargate Project's most arousing claim, but it also serves as its greatest cautionary tale. It forces you to confront the reality that what looks like a miraculous breakthrough might just be a reflection of what we already know, a testament not to the power of the paranormal, but to the power of our own imperfect minds. The project's ambition reaches its zenith. You're no longer simply observing the past or a distant planet. You're now attempting to perceive events that have not yet happened. The concept of temporal remote viewing is introduced, and it's a leap from the already questionable realm of psychic espionage into a philosophical and scientific minefield. A well-established fact is that later in the Stargate Project's life, some of its psychics were tasked with looking into the future or the past. This was a direct extension of the belief that if the mind could transcend spatial distance, it could also transcend the linear flow of time. They were asked to describe historical events before conventional historical data was provided, or to describe a future event that had yet to occur. One of the more bizarre and less-known details of these sessions was the psychological and intellectual struggle it presented to the viewers. How do you describe an event that has not yet happened? The impressions were often symbolic, metaphorical, and highly unreliable. A viewer might describe a feeling of dread or a sense of falling, and these impressions could be later interpreted to be a market crash or a political scandal. The problem was that these vague descriptions could be made to fit 1,000 different outcomes, making it impossible to verify the psychic's genuine ability to see the future. The project's leaders were essentially asking their psychics to become oracles, but the results were far more muddled than any mythological prophecy. The philosophical problem was immense. If the future can be seen, does that mean it is predetermined? The scientists and military officials involved were suddenly grappling with questions of free will and causality, concepts that were far outside their conventional scope of expertise. This leads you to a critical question. When does an inquiry stop being a scientific pursuit and become an exercise in faith? The entire foundation of science is built on the principle of causality, that a cause must precede an effect. Temporal remote viewing directly challenged this principle. Was the project's willingness to embrace this concept a sign of its intellectual courage, or a sign that it had strayed so far from its scientific roots that it was now willing to believe in anything? The project, in its final, desperate years, was a testament to the idea that in the face of uncertainty, the human mind will often prefer to believe in the impossible rather than admit that some questions simply have no answer. The psychics were trying to see the future, but they may have been blind to the fact that they were simply projecting their own hopes and fears onto the canvas of time. The atmosphere in the intelligence community is no longer one of psychic wonder but of deep suspicion. You're now inside a secure, high-level briefing where the very purpose of the Stargate Project is being questioned. This is a well-established, though often overlooked fact about the project's history. The possibility that it was, at least in part, an elaborate disinformation campaign. The theory is a cynical and compelling one, suggesting that the entire project was not designed to gather psychic intelligence, but to deceive the Soviet Union into believing that the US had such a capability. The logic is chillingly brilliant. If you can convince your enemy that you possess a weapon they cannot counter, they will be forced to waste their own resources trying to develop it all, while you quietly invest in conventional and more effective technologies. The foundation of this theory lies in a lesser-known detail about the project's public-facing side. While the project was classified, rumors and stories about American psychic spies were allowed to leak out. Proponents of the disinformation theory suggest that these leaks were not accidental, but were carefully orchestrated to fuel Soviet paranoia. Think of it as a low-cost, high-yield psychological operation. The CIA didn't need to actually find Soviet submarines with their minds. They just needed to make the Soviets think they could. The more the Soviets invested in their own psychotronic research, the more they diverted resources from their nuclear or cyber programs, giving the US a strategic advantage. The Stargate Project, in this view, was a form of strategic misdirection, a grand magician's trick on a global scale. The psychics were not the spies, they were the bait. This leads you to a profound question that challenges the very nature of truth and deception. When a government program is designed to create a lie, can it ever truly know what is real and what is fabricated? If the project's own scientists and psychics began to genuinely believe in their abilities, were they the victims of their own government's deception? The line between playing a part and becoming the character you're playing can become dangerously blurred, and in the case of Stargate, the project's participants may have been so deeply immersed in the narrative of psychic warfare that they could no longer distinguish between the performance and the reality. The project, in this sense, was less a scientific experiment and more a psychological test of how deeply a person can be made to believe a manufactured reality. The narrative shifts from the impersonal corridors of government to the deeply personal experiences of the people who were at the heart of the project. You're no longer an outside observer, but are now listening to the voices of the remote viewers themselves. A well-established fact is that after the project's declassification, a number of former Stargate participants like Joseph McMoneagle, Ingo Swann, and Lynn Buchanan went public with their stories. They became the public face of the project, writing books, giving interviews, and attempting to legitimize their work in the court of public opinion. Their accounts offer a fascinating and often contradictory look at the project's inner workings. Their stories are filled with both moments of awe-inspiring success and profound frustration. They describe the immense mental and emotional toll the work took. One lesser-known detail is the psychological impact of being a psychic spy. The remote viewers had to learn to separate their own subconscious thoughts and memories from the psychic impressions they were receiving. This was a constant battle, and it often led to a form of mental exhaustion. The pressure to perform was immense, and the lack of consistent, verifiable results took a toll on their confidence and their mental health. Some of the viewers became true believers, convinced that they were at the forefront of a new human capability, while others were more skeptical, viewing their work as an interesting, but ultimately inconclusive experiment. This brings you to a critical question. When a person dedicates years of their life to a project like Stargate, and it becomes the defining aspect of their identity, can their testimony ever be truly objective? Are their success stories genuine proof of their abilities, or are they a form of cognitive dissonance, a way of justifying years of hard work and self-doubt? The remote viewers themselves were a paradox. They were both the subjects and the arbiters of their own reality. Their experiences, while compelling, are filtered through the lens of their own deeply personal investment in the project's success. You find yourself listening to their stories and realizing that while they provide a crucial human element to the Stargate saga, they may not provide a definitive answer. They are a testament to the power of belief, but whether that belief was founded on a genuine psychic ability or a deep-seated human need to find meaning in the unknown is a question that remains as elusive as the project itself. You're back in the quiet, unassuming rooms where the work of a psychic spy was a daily grind. This is a closer look at the psychic's protocol, the daily routine and training exercises that the Stargate participants endured. A well-established fact is that the project developed a highly structured training regimen, particularly under the guidance of Ingo Swann, a key figure in the program. Swann's approach, known as Coordinate Remote Viewing (CRV), was a step-by-step process designed to train the mind to access and interpret psychic data. The psychics would sit in a room, often with a facilitator, and be given a set of numerical coordinates. Their task was to clear their minds and enter a kind of meditative state, a process they called Stage 1, where they would get a vague impression of the target. From there, they would progress through successive stages, adding more detail and complexity to their descriptions, moving from general impressions of water or land to specific details about structures and colors. A lesser-known detail about this protocol is the immense discipline it required. The psychics were trained to ignore their own conscious minds and the chatter of their imaginations. They were taught to trust their initial fleeting impressions, a process that was often described as counterintuitive. They had to learn to differentiate between what they were imagining and what they were perceiving. The training included exercises where they would remote view simple targets like a specific geometric shape in a sealed envelope, and would be given immediate feedback on their accuracy. This was a form of mental calisthenics, designed to hone their psychic abilities and build a library of mental signatures for different types of objects and environments. The training was less about teaching a skill and more about unteaching a lifetime of conventional thinking. This leads you to a critical question. When a person is trained to bypass their rational mind and focus on fleeting, non-rational impressions, how do they protect themselves from self-deception? Is the training a tool for unlocking a genuine ability? Or is it a method for creating a shared delusion where a group of people are all trained to interpret vague impressions in the same way? The psychics believed they were learning a new kind of language, but skeptics would argue they were simply learning a new kind of subjective interpretation. The protocol was designed to be a bridge between science and the paranormal, but it may have just been a well-meaning attempt to apply a structured method to something that defies all structure. The psychics were entering a world without rules, but they were trying to do it with a very rigid playbook. The focus shifts now to the scientists and academics involved, the men and women who had to balance their professional reputations with the unorthodox nature of a government-funded paranormal program. You see them sitting in their offices, poring over data, facing a profound scientist's dilemma. A well-established fact is that physicists like Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ, and later others from more diverse fields, were risking their careers by participating in the Stargate Project. The academic and scientific communities were, and largely still are, deeply skeptical of psychic phenomena. The very act of associating one's name with such research could lead to professional ostracism, the loss of grants, and a permanent black mark on their resumes. They were caught between a genuine curiosity about the limits of human consciousness and the very real threat of professional ruin. A lesser-known detail about their struggle is the constant pressure they faced from both sides. The military and intelligence community wanted results, and they wanted them quickly. They were less concerned with the minutiae of double-blind studies and more interested in actionable intelligence. The scientific community, on the other hand, demanded an almost impossibly high standard of proof for something that defied all known physical laws. The scientists in the middle were in an impossible position. They were trying to apply the rigorous standards of physics and engineering to a phenomenon that seemed to operate on its own, unpredictable rules. They were forced to make compromises, to cut corners, and to accept data that might not have passed peer review in a more conventional field. This created a tension that ran throughout the project, a constant battle between the demands of a classified, results-oriented government program and the slow, methodical process of genuine scientific inquiry. This leads you to a critical question. When does a scientist's curiosity become a form of cognitive bias, leading them to see what they want to see, rather than what the data truly shows? Were the scientists involved in Stargate a group of intellectual pioneers brave enough to challenge the scientific orthodoxy? Or were they a group of true believers who, in their eagerness to prove the impossible, abandoned the very principles that define their profession? Their dilemma was a microcosm of the entire project's struggle, a desire for truth that was constantly at war with the human element of hope, belief, and professional self-preservation. You can almost feel their internal conflict, the quiet desperation to find that one piece of data, that one perfect session, that would finally silence the critics and validate a lifetime of unconventional work. But that perfect piece of data, like the paranormal phenomena they were chasing, always seemed to be just out of reach. The story of the Stargate Project is not just about believers and scientists, but also about those who became disillusioned. You're now listening to the voice of a whistleblower, a former participant who decided to break the code of silence and reveal the project's inner workings and, more importantly, its failures. A well-established fact is that, as the project wound down in the mid-1990s, some former participants, like former Army Major Lynn Buchanan, became vocal critics of the program's lack of rigor and its unproven nature. They weren't skeptics in the traditional sense. They had participated in the project and believed in the potential of remote viewing, but they were deeply critical of the way the program was managed and the way the results were presented. A lesser-known detail about these whistleblowers is the immense personal risk they took. They were former government employees, bound by confidentiality agreements, and speaking out could have had severe professional and legal repercussions. They weren't motivated by fame or fortune. They were motivated by a sense of duty to set the record straight. They revealed that the project's successes were often highly exaggerated and that the vast majority of the sessions were failures. They detailed the intense pressure to produce results and the internal culture of confirmation bias. The accounts of these insiders painted a picture of a program that was not the psychic espionage success story, but a slow-motion car crash of unproven science and government bureaucracy. This brings you to a critical question. Should we trust the testimony of those who have a vested interest in exposing a program's failures, or those who have a vested interest in defending its successes? The whistleblowers, by coming forward, provided a much-needed counterbalance to the stories of psychic triumphs. They humanized the project's flaws and showed that even within the classified world of government secrets, There were people who valued truth over secrecy. Their testimony is a powerful reminder that the most important information is often not what is kept secret, but what is revealed, and that the biggest lie a government can tell is often the one it tells to itself. The end is now in sight. You're no longer in a room of active investigation, but in the offices where budgets are being reviewed and projects are being terminated. This is the story of the Stargate Project's unraveling. A well-established fact is that the project, for all its high-profile claims, was quietly and steadily defunded throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s. The Cold War was winding down, and with the Soviet Union collapsing, the initial paranoia that fueled the project's existence began to dissipate. The need for a psychic army to counter a phantom Soviet threat simply no longer existed. The budget cuts were a death by 1,000 cuts, slowly but surely starving the project of the resources it needed to continue. A lesser-known detail about this period is the shift in focus from active intelligence gathering to pure research. The project's proponents, seeing the writing on the wall, tried to justify its existence by rebranding it as a purely scientific inquiry into the nature of consciousness. They argued that even if the results weren't immediately useful for intelligence, the fundamental research into psychic phenomena was a worthy pursuit. This was a last-ditch effort to keep the project alive, but it was a tough sell. The military and intelligence communities were looking for tangible results, and the project simply couldn't deliver them. The slow, methodical process of scientific inquiry was no match for the urgency of a post-Cold War world that was rapidly restructuring its priorities. This brings you to a critical question. Was the Stargate Project a victim of its own success or its own failure? Did it die because it was no longer needed, or because it never truly delivered on its promise? The project's end was not a dramatic declassification in a press conference. It was a slow, quiet fade into obscurity, a whimper rather than a bang. It was a clear sign that in the absence of an existential threat, the belief in psychic spies was no longer a viable option for a government that had to justify its spending to the American people. The project had a beginning fueled by fear and ended with the quiet resignation that it had simply run its course. The slow, quiet death of the project is followed by an unexpected rebirth in the public eye. You're now in the mid-1990s, and the government has decided to declassify the Stargate Project files. This is a well-established fact of the project's history. In 1995, the CIA released a trove of documents related to its decades-long psychic research program. The official declassification was a watershed moment, finally confirming what had long been whispered in the shadows of the conspiracy world. The public and the media, a mix of believers and skeptics, reacted with a mixture of shock, amusement, and a renewed sense of wonder about the limits of the human mind. The files confirmed the existence of the program, the names of the psychics, and some of the more bizarre taskings, like the remote viewing of Mars. A lesser-known detail about the declassification is that the CIA, in a moment of unprecedented transparency, also commissioned a formal review of the project's data. They hired the American Institutes for Research, AIR, to conduct an independent, unbiased review of the entire body of work. This was a move to put the matter to rest once and for all. The AIR's mission was to analyze the thousands of pages of data, transcripts, and reports and to deliver a final scientific verdict on the project's success. The review was a clear attempt to provide a definitive, objective conclusion to a decades-long saga. This brings you to a critical question. What does a government declassification really mean? Was this a genuine attempt at transparency, or was it a strategic move to preemptively control the narrative and get ahead of a story that was about to break anyway? By commissioning an independent review and releasing the files, the government was able to frame the narrative on their own terms. They could present the project as a Cold War curiosity that was thoroughly investigated and ultimately found to be a failure. This allowed them to put the entire matter to bed without having to answer the lingering questions that would inevitably arise. The release of the files was both a reveal and a final act of control, a way of burying the project in the public record while simultaneously making it seem like a triumph of transparency. The long-awaited verdict has arrived. You're now reading the final report from the American Institutes for Research, AIR. The findings are not what the project's proponents had hoped for, but they are definitive. A well-established fact is that the AIR's review concluded that the Stargate Project's results were inconclusive and riddled with methodological flaws. The report found no compelling evidence that the psychics had produced any useful intelligence. It pointed to a litany of issues, including a lack of consistent, standardized protocols, poor data collection, and a high potential for confirmation bias. The review was a scientific debunking of the entire project, finding that its claimed successes could be attributed to a combination of chance, clever guessing, and the subconscious cues of the experimenters. A lesser-known detail of the report is its nuanced but ultimately damning language. The report didn't say that psychic abilities were impossible. Instead, it concluded that the project, as conducted, was not a valid scientific test of those abilities. It was a critique of the methodology, not of the phenomena itself. This distinction was crucial, as it left a small door open for future research while simultaneously closing the book on the Stargate Project. The AIR's final verdict was that while the project had generated a lot of data, it had not generated a single piece of evidence that could stand up to rigorous scientific scrutiny. This leads you to a critical question. In the absence of a smoking gun, do you believe the project's own claims of success, or do you believe the independent scientific analysis that found its methods to be flawed? The AIR report was the final word from the U.S. government on the matter, a clear signal that the project was a failure. But for the true believers, the report was just a political document, a convenient way for the government to distance itself from a project that had become an embarrassment. The verdict was in, but the debate, as you'll soon find, was far from over. The curtain has fallen on the official investigation, but the show is far from over. You're now witnessing the enduring cultural impact of the Stargate Project. A well-established fact is that even after its official debunking, the project has continued to influence popular culture, from television shows like Stranger Things and The X-Files to movies like The Men Who Stare at Goats. The narrative of psychic spies, of the government harnessing the power of the mind, has become a staple of science fiction and conspiracy lore. The project gave a name and a seemingly legitimate backstory to a concept that had long existed in the fringes of society. It took the idea of a psychic and placed it in the context of Cold War espionage, making it feel less like a fantastical power and more like a top-secret military program. A lesser-known detail is how the project's declassified files became a new kind of Rorschach test for the public. For believers, the files were a vindication, proof that the government had a secret program that was, at the very least, looking into psychic abilities. The official debunking was simply a cover story, a way for the government to hide its true capabilities. For skeptics, the files were a cautionary tale, a perfect example of how Cold War paranoia and a lack of scientific rigor could lead to millions of dollars being wasted on a fruitless endeavor. The project's legacy is not a definitive answer, but a powerful example of how a government secret can take on a life of its own in the public imagination, shaping beliefs and influencing narratives long after the project itself has ended. This brings you to a critical question. Why are we so fascinated by the idea of government psychics? Does our fascination with the Stargate Project say more about a genuine belief in the paranormal, or a deep-seated suspicion of government secrecy, and a desire to believe that the world is more mysterious than it appears? The project's legacy is not in what it proved, but in the story it allowed us to tell ourselves about the secret world of power and the hidden potential of the human mind. The final tantalizing pieces of the puzzle remain. Even after the official declassification and the damning report from the AIR, there are specific unanswered questions that continue to haunt the Stargate saga. This is a well-established fact. The declassified files, for all their detail, contain tantalizing gaps and inconsistencies. While the government's official conclusion is that the project was a failure, certain incidents are still fiercely debated and have never been fully explained to the satisfaction of both believers and skeptics. For example, some of the most famous hits, like the one involving the downed Soviet bomber or the Chinese nuclear facility, have never been fully reconciled. The question remains, how could a remote viewer with no conventional information provide details that were later confirmed by intelligence agencies? Was it a fluke? A lucky guess? Or was it something more? The answer, to this day, remains elusive, and the specific details of those missions are still debated. A lesser-known detail about these lingering questions is the fate of some of the key personnel. What happened to the scientists and military officials who were deeply involved in the project and genuinely believed in its potential? Many of them went on to found private companies that offered remote viewing services to corporate clients, a testament to their continued belief in the practice. Their continued commitment, even after the government had officially washed its hands of the project, suggests that their belief was not based on a government paycheck, but on a genuine conviction that they had witnessed something extraordinary. The question of what they truly saw and why they continued to believe in it remains a powerful, lingering mystery. This brings you to a critical question that transcends the project itself. How do we reconcile the official narrative with the anecdotal evidence? When the government says a program was a failure, but the people who were in it say it had moments of genuine success, who do you believe? The unanswered questions of the Stargate Project are not just about psychic abilities. They are about the nature of truth, secrecy, and the powerful and often contradictory role of personal experience in shaping our understanding of reality. Let's engage in a thought experiment, one that forces us to move beyond the official conclusions and into the realm of pure possibility. What if it worked? What if, against all scientific odds and despite the official report, the Stargate Project had definitively proven the existence of psychic abilities? This is a fundamental and mind-bending question that allows you to explore the hypothetical implications for science and society. A well-established fact is that the project's official failure is the bedrock of our understanding of it. But if you remove that bedrock, the entire edifice of our reality begins to shift. If the project had been a success, the first thing to fall would have been the walls of conventional physics. The very laws of space, time, and causality would have to be rewritten. The concept of action at a distance, where one object can influence another without any physical contact, would have to be revisited. This would have been a revolution on par with Einstein's theory of relativity, or the discovery of quantum mechanics. It would have meant that consciousness was not just a product of the brain, but a force that could interact with the physical world in ways we had never imagined. It would have opened the door to a new kind of science, a science of the mind. A lesser-known detail about this hypothetical scenario is the profound philosophical and ethical dilemmas it would have created. If a person's thoughts could be perceived across great distances, what would that mean for privacy? Would there be such a thing as a truly private thought? If psychics could see the future, would it be ethical to use that information to manipulate events? Would it be possible to predict a crime before it happened? And would that person be held accountable for a thought crime? The discovery of psychic abilities would not have just been a scientific breakthrough. It would have been a moral and ethical crisis forcing humanity to confront a new reality, where the human mind was not just a passive observer, but an active participant in the physical world. This leads you to a critical question. Would humanity be better off knowing the truth about psychic abilities? Or would the knowledge of such power lead to a new kind of Cold War, a psychic arms race that could be even more destructive than the nuclear one it mirrored? The project's failure may be a source of frustration for believers, but perhaps in the end it was a blessing in disguise. A silent signal that some doors are better left closed. We arrive at the final chapter of our investigation, bringing together all the threads of this extraordinary saga. You now see the full picture, a complex tapestry woven from scientific inquiry, Cold War paranoia, and the enduring human belief in the mysterious. This final section is a summary of the project's entire journey, from its ambitious beginning to its controversial end. A well-established fact is that the Stargate Project was a uniquely American response to a perceived Soviet threat, a multi-million-dollar program that sought to weaponize the most enigmatic and least understood part of human existence: consciousness. It was a period when the government was willing to explore a radical notion, not because it was proven, but because the alternative, that the enemy was ahead, was too terrifying to contemplate. We've explored the genesis of remote viewing at SRI, fueled by the controversial demonstrations of Uri Geller, and the creation of a new kind of spy, trained to perceive the world with their mind's eye. We've grappled with the messy, unpredictable nature of the data, the subjectivity of the scoring, and the potential for confirmation bias. We've walked through the project's most famous hits, from the missing general to the pyramids on Mars. and we've analyzed the methodological flaws that make those successes so difficult to believe. We've considered the possibility that the entire project was an elaborate disinformation campaign, a masterful deception designed to mislead an adversary. A lesser-known, yet crucial detail is that the project's greatest legacy may not be in what it proved about psychic abilities, but in what it revealed about the human condition. It showed us our capacity for both incredible ingenuity and profound self-deception. It was a testament to the power of belief, and a cautionary tale about what happens when that belief is not anchored by rigorous, objective standards. The project's official failure does not diminish its importance. In fact, it enhances it. The Stargate Project is a powerful example of the lengths we will go to in the pursuit of power and security, and the ways in which our own minds can be both our greatest tool and our greatest weakness. This leaves you with one final lingering question. Will we ever stop looking for answers in the paranormal? The Stargate Project may be over, but the questions it sought to answer are as old as humanity itself. The desire to see the unseen, to know the unknown, and to unlock the hidden potential of our minds is a fundamental part of who we are. Perhaps the real paranormal phenomenon isn't psychic ability, but our relentless, enduring hope that it exists. That's all for today. We've journeyed through decades of government secrecy, scientific controversy, and the enduring mystery of the human mind. The Stargate Project may have been officially closed, but its legacy lives on in the shadows of our shared history. It stands as a powerful reminder that the most fascinating stories are often the ones that can never be fully explained. Stay curious, stay questioning, and I'll see you in the next file.